In this video, we're going to be talking about data sources and how you can create new data sources and use them in your MindStudio workflows. Let's go ahead and get started. When we talk about data sources, there are a few different types of data sources that we could be referring to. The first kind is a data source like a connection to a third-party service. And typically for that kind of data, you're bringing in data from that service, you're using an integration block, which we have a whole separate video about. And then the other kind of data source is a connection to your own internal database. And we're going to be creating an advanced video on how to do this in MindStudio. The data source that we are talking about specifically in this video is the data source that you can create directly inside of your project. This is inside of the data sources folder here on the left-hand side, and we're going to be building an AI agent to illustrate how to create them and what they do. So let's go ahead and get started. We're going to be making a support bot that allows the end user to ask a question, and then we're going to reference a data source and bring in contextual information from that data source to answer the question. And for this case, it's going to be for MindStudio support. I'm going to upload all of the documentation, and the AI is going to reference that documentation. So let's get started by beginning to build out our AI agent here. I'm going to add a user input block, and that input block is going to contain the user input query. Now, I've already created this user input, but it basically asks the user to ask a question about MindStudio. Once that is done, we're going to need to query our data source, and we're going to be using this query in order to retrieve the information. So let's go ahead and create a data source. We can do that by hovering over the folder and clicking on the plus button. And from here, we are able to name our data source. So I'm going to call mine MindStudio Docs, and we're going to add a description, all of the docs for MindStudio. And we can add all kinds of different files to our data source. In fact, you can add up to 150 files per data source that you create. Each file needs to be a maximum of 50 megabytes. So you might have files that are much bigger. I recommend that you either compress those files or split them up. And there are plenty of free services online that do these kinds of things. So I'm going to go ahead and upload the PDF of our documentation. I've actually run this through one of those free services. You can see the original PDF is 80 megabytes, but when I use this free service, it compressed down to 6 megabytes, and that is great. We're going to go ahead and upload that. And while this uploads and processes, I want to highlight some information that you can find here on the right-hand side. You can access the name, you can access the description, which we have created. There is this index snippet, which is going to directly reference all of the text from the data source. And then we have the vector query tester here. And this is where we're going to be able to test out various queries that we can use inside of our query data source block, which we'll add in a second. So right now this is extracting text, and what it's doing is it's creating a vector database that we're going to be able to query. And this is one of the advantages of creating a data source in MindStudio versus referencing a relational database like a table or a spreadsheet or something like that, is we can write a natural language query similar to a Google search. It's going to search for the most relevant text to answer that question and provide it back, and we can use that as context for a generation block later downstream. So while this is processing, let's go ahead and continue our workflow because we don't have to wait for it to finish processing to continue working. I'm going to go ahead, and the way that we're going to query our data source is by using this query data source block. And this query data source block has a couple of settings. You need to select the data source, which we've already created, and we can set the output variable name. And this is going to be the result of the query. It's what specific chunks of text are returned after we send a query to the data source. So I'm going to call this query result. We can also determine the number of times that we query that data source. So we're going to leave this at 3. I believe the maximum is 5 when you're querying a data source. And then the next thing we want to do is enter our query. And this is going to be just the original query that we are collecting from our end user. So we can simply put that query, although you are able to put in additional instructions. Just keep in mind that it's going to reference all of that text and try to find the most relevant information for that particular query. So it looks like the data source has finished processing. So let's go ahead and open it up. And I'm going to show you a couple of other things. So you'll notice that once it is uploaded, we do get a word count and a vector count here. You can see that this document is 50,000 words, 54,000 words. We can take a deeper dive into the document by clicking on the document itself or this arrow. This is going to open up a view of the document that gives us some additional information. For example, we have the preview of the entire document, and we'll be able to see here that this is about, 400 pages of text. It's all of our documentation. And we have a couple of other tabs, so we are able to see the extracted text, and this is all in Markdown, as you can see here. And one thing to check when you upload files is you want to make sure that there are no strange symbols, there's no weird spacing. You want to make sure that the text looks exactly how it looks in your preview, other than it being unstyled. And the reason for that is if you start to see weird symbols or weird spacing, it could be an indication that your file is malformed. And so you're going to need to troubleshoot that. But you can use the extracted text as an early indicator for something like that. The next tab will show you all of the raw chunks. So when you create a vector database, all of the text is separated into these things called chunks, and it's going to return a chunk of text that it thinks is relevant to the query that you have entered. So when we query that data source, it might return this chunk, and it might return this chunk, and it might return this chunk, and we're going to use those chunks as context for generating a response for via AI model. Last thing you can see is all of the vectors. This is more for technical folks, and it's kind of the relationship between various words and phrases inside of our data source. We don't have to worry about that at all, but kind of interesting to take a look at. And then finally, on the right-hand side here, we get all of the document details. And that includes an AI-generated summary, which we are able to pull from here using this access snippet, as well as the data source details we saw at the front here. And that includes this index snippet, which allows us to pull the context entirety of the data source for our AI workflow. So let's go ahead and finish our workflow here now that we have kind of all of this foundational information. We have entered our query, and now we're going to be generating some text here using the generate text block. We're going to make sure that we include the query result as context at the beginning. So I'm going to create some tags called context, and we'll close those tags out. There we go. And then inside, we're going to have our variable called query result. And then at this point, we're going to say use the info above to answer the following question. And then we're going to include the original query here. There we go. And you can create a prompt that is not as direct as this. There are many ways to use data sources, but this is just kind of illustrating the concept that it's going to query that data source and get a result. We're going to use that result as context to provide to an AI model, and then it's going to answer that original query here. So now this AI agent is complete. Let's go ahead and preview it. If we open up the draft agent here, we should be able to ask a question about data sources. Why don't we ask, tell me about data sources in MindStudio. How can I use them? There we go. Let's go ahead and click the next button. And at this point, it is querying the data source, and it has provided some context that is giving it the ability to answer this question for us. So you can see here that we now have information about data sources. It answered what are data sources. It gave us all of these upload limits, which are accurate to our documentation. It gives us key features, and then we can continue chatting with it if we have other questions. And one thing that we can do here in this chat session is we can use some special message processing where we can utilize RAG, retrieval augmented generation, and actually reference that original data source when we start to ask questions. So now each time that we ask a new question, it's going to continue referencing that original data source that we have created. So let's go ahead and refresh this. And now we can say, tell me about text generation. Now it's going to reference the data source. Oh, and it thinks that we're still talking about data sources. So let's go ahead and we will reload the draft here because it was pulling in the other context. So we could say, tell me about text generation using AI. Now it's querying the data source, it's sending the message, and it says there are AI models for text generation. It tells us about the model configurations, considerations when generating text, all of that good information. So every time we ask a question, it's going to reference that data source and retrieve a new chunk from the data source itself. Now, let's say we wanted to reference the entire documentation. Well, first we would need to consider a model that is able to take in all of those tokens. And so we'll want to take a model, something like, actually Claude 3.5 Haiku should work because its context window is 200,000 tokens. So 50,000 words should be just fine for Claude 3.5 Haiku. So why don't we continue using this model? And then we are going to, rather than referencing the query result, we can just reference the entire text of this document simply by using this index snippet. So this index snippet is going to bring in the entirety of the text from the data source. And I would recommend that you use this sparingly because you might be overloading the AI with your prompt here, and it might not be able to find specifically what you're looking for. Especially with 50,000 words, it can be quite difficult for AI to process. But that is how you would use something like this. It would be bringing in all of the text from your entire data source. So that is all 50,000 words here. It's like if we had copied and pasted this entire document here into the context section of our prompt. So that is data sources in a nutshell. Hopefully you learned something valuable. If you like this video, give us a like. If you have questions, leave a question in the comments section of this video. And don't forget to subscribe to MindStudio for more updates. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.